In this lecture, we're looking at the young life of John Calvin. And we can begin by just noting some of the contours and some of the context of how we come to understand these years of Calvin's life. As we said in our last lecture, we really don't have as much of the rich information, either from Calvin's own pen or from simple archival evidence or other pieces, to really piece together a real complex picture of the young life of Calvin. When you compare that to the young life of Luther, which has been subject, as we pointed out, to all kinds of psychoanalysis, where we attempt to understand how Luther's relationship with his father and his mother may have had an impact on his Reformation. And of course, in those lectures, we talked about how a significant number of those conclusions about Luther are wildly off base. When it comes to the life of Calvin, we actually have only a very little bit about his early years from Calvin himself. Calvin, of course, is quite shy, or at least unwilling to talk a great deal about himself. Now, this almost certainly comes from not only a personal conviction, but also a theological conviction. Calvin has an element in his psyche and in his theological outlook where he simply does not want the focus really to be on himself. And you can really see this in how their remains are handled. Calvin, for example, when he died, actually left strict orders that he was to be buried in an unmarked grave, and that no excessive or elaborate ceremonies were to be held, and that his bones were to be lost forever in an unmarked grave. Compare that with Luther, who, if you go today to the Wittenberg church, his grave, his coffin, is buried literally beneath the pulpit. It's right there in the middle of the church. Now, that's more what was done on behalf of Luther by his followers, and Luther never left really the strict commands that he was to be buried there. But this is sort of a tone of Calvin's personality, as well as part of his theological convictions, that he believes that the focus should not be on him or his life or on his legacy per se. He's always pointing to the scriptures, you might say. Again, not that Luther was not, but Luther always had this self-identity as the man who had caused the Reformation. And so in some ways, to be buried beneath the pulpit of the Wittenberg church is just kind of fitting for Luther's personality. Calvin, though, never really tells us much about his early life. The stories that we have of his early life, though, come from two main books. The first is The Life of Calvin, written by Calvin's successor, his right-hand man for the latter years in Geneva, named Theodore Beza. And Beza is one of these important figures in terms of the evolving nature of the Reformed tradition. He's one of the principal voices, and a lot of his challenges to certain doctrines and certain positions over the years, as well as his development of things like the doctrine of predestination, really sort of kick off an ongoing legacy of Reformed scholastic thinking. Now, he's not the only one, but he's one of the major voices. Well, Beza, before he died, penned a life of Calvin, in which he retold and compiled all of the evidence and the stories that they knew about Calvin's life in order to write a full biography of the man. There was another one from one of Calvin's friends, another Swiss Reformed pastor named Nicholas Culloden. And in 1565, he actually wrote another biography of Calvin, which is enormously helpful. Because again, this is a friend and a contemporary of Calvin's writing a great deal about Calvin's life. So with these two books, along with archival research and other types of research, we have a pretty good outline as to where Calvin's life developed. Calvin was born on the 10th of July, 1509. He was born in the Picardy region of a city known as Noyon. Now note this, he's French. Calvin is not Swiss and he's not German. When Calvin actually flees from France after his conversion, he is actually, for the remainder of his life, in exile. Now, he ends up in a French-speaking city, Geneva, but it's one of the more curious things about Calvin's life, and it really juxtaposes well with Luther's. Luther spent essentially the entirety of his life in the city of Wittenberg, which is where he got his Reformation going. Calvin did not have that same power base. He was always in exile. He was an outsider. And even though the city embraced him to a certain extent, there were always enemies in the city of Geneva, because Calvin and some of his cronies were those Frenchmen who had come into their midst and were telling them what to do when they didn't like it. But Calvin is a Frenchman. Notice also that he's born a bit later than the vast majority of the first generation of Protestants. Calvin really fits somewhere in between first and second generation reformers. He's a bit younger than the vast majority of the first generation of reformers, like Luther and Butzer and Zwingli. But he's not so old that he's not really a contemporary of them either. Calvin actually will be something like a younger brother, in a sense, to men like Bullinger and Butzer. Now, it's not a pedantic relationship by any means, but when Calvin comes sort of rushing onto the scene in Geneva in the 1530s, a number of these men had been about the Reformation for well over a decade, if not longer. And so Calvin is more of the young guy coming in to contribute to the Reformation, rather than a man who was sort of leading the charge from the first generation and from the opening bell. Well, Calvin is born in 1509, and his father is Gerard and Jean. Now, notice I'm going to go ahead and anglicize all of these names. For the sake of not sounding like a bozo, I'm going to not even attempt French pronunciation for your sake. But Gerard and Jean were his father and his mother. Now, Calvin's mother died at a very young age. It doesn't say a whole lot about this. We don't know how this affected him personally. Obviously, in this day and age, death, particularly the death of females, was extraordinarily high. Most of them died in childbirth or through some complication related to childbirth. And so the death of a mother, while never good, was not unheard of in this day and age. But he lost his mother at a young age. And Gerard was a notary and a registrar for the local chapter of the cathedral, which means he was an unordained but vital figure within the ecclesiastical structure of this part of France. To be a notary and a registrar means that they were at the heart of the power and the business and the administration of the diocese and of all the churches in the region. Gerard, in other words, is at a powerful place, though he himself is not the source of that power. And he actually would die in 1531, which is just on the eve of Calvin's conversion. So we don't have recorded what his position would have been or the way he might have taken the idea that Calvin has switched to the Protestant faith. But notice, his father Gerard is not part of the workerman's stock. He's not blue collar. He's very much at the heart of the ecclesiastical structure. And this actually would have an impact on Calvin, both in terms of his formation for education, as well as for his experience within the church. Because at the age of 12, Calvin, we can assume already a precocious little guy, is admitted to be the clerk to the bishop. Now, again, this is a bit like his father's role. It's an assistant, it's someone who is supporting the role of the bishop. It's not ordained, and it's not intended to be, but yet it is also a vital part of the ecclesiastical structure. Actually, Calvin took the tonsure, which is the ritual shaving of the head, the top of the crown of the head, which gives the person the impression, depending on how much hair they have, I suppose, of having a crown of thorns upon their head. And so Calvin, at the age of 12, is tonsured, and he's admitted as a clerk to the bishop. And it's because of these networks of power, which in this day and age is just about everything. But it's because of these networks of power with the bishop and with the elites of this area of France that Calvin gets the springboard that propels him onto the academic stage. Because while he is a clerk for the bishop, again, his natural talents are recognized, and he actually falls under the patronage of the Montmore's family. Now, I should describe this just briefly. In this day and age, often what would happen is landed elites or wealthy families were not required, but there was sort of a civic duty of those who were wealthy to support the best and the brightest of those who come from their local region or from their cities. So families would pay at times for artists to get their training or to commission some of their works. And another way that this would often happen, the patronage system, was in the supporting of the education of a precocious young child who needs to go on and get a first-rate education to propel them onto the academic or the intellectual scene. And that's exactly what happens here with Calvin. The Montmore's family actually patronizes, as we say, or offers patronage to Calvin to go off not long after he takes his tonsure to the Collège de la Marque. And the Collège de la Marque is a Latin school in the city of Paris and it's frankly one of the most important Latin schools for children in all of France. There was a teacher there, Mathurin Cordier, who is by far one of the most important teachers of Latin grammar and of rhetoric of his generation. Now, I don't want to overstress that. There were certainly many others who were at about his same level. But Cordier is well known in particular, not simply because he was good at teaching, and not simply because he was good at rhetoric, but he actually was a man who thought long and hard about how to teach, about pedagogy, as we say today. Cordier was the chair of rhetoric at the Collège de la Marque. And rhetoric, of course, in this day and age, is not simply empty words or nice flowing written grammar. Rather, rhetoric was the backbone of just about everything when it came to intellectual formation in this day and age. It's the idea of persuasion and good rhetoric as the backbone to theological education itself. Being able to communicate effectively and winsomely, the use of rhetoric was supreme in the task of those who were theologians and churchmen and politicians. Every subject held rhetoric in the highest of regards because of its role in shaping the communication of their disciplines. So when Calvin gets this patronage and he gets sent to the Collège de la Marque, he's actually entering into one of the most important contexts and frameworks for the learning of Latin language and grammar and rhetoric of just about anywhere else in France. And this is important because, as we've already said, so much of Calvin's life, he was known for being a very clear writer. People who get into the Latin of Calvin's writing often are impressed with the very crisp, clean style of his writing, the kind of effortless way that he would bring together his points. And even in the English translations, you get this somewhat. He rarely seems to lose you along the way. There's no word out of place, you like to think. Now, that's not to say that everyone always finds them as riveting as others. But when you actually get into the writing style of Calvin, he is extraordinarily good. In fact, by and large, he's one of the most impressive writers of the entirety of the 16th century. Erasmus, of course, gets the high praise for his rhetorical flourishes and his style. He obviously was the prince of the humanists. But too often it's ignored that Calvin himself was actually one of the most impressive writers of Latin rhetoric of the entirety of the 16th century, particularly in Protestantism. And a lot of this is traced to the initial work and the initial teaching of Cordier. Cordier actually will go on to write a book called the Colloquia, which is a book on how to teach Latin, which will be used for centuries in France and in other countries in an effort to train young children in the subject of Latin and rhetoric. He's just simply that important. Now, what's interesting about Cordier is he actually becomes a Protestant. Not only that, but he becomes a Reformed person. He follows Calvin and others into Geneva and into other parts of Switzerland, where he often sets up shop in the city of other reformers, and he teaches Latin. He spent a time, for example, in the city of Geneva, teaching Latin to young children while Calvin was at work at the Reformation of the city. And actually, Calvin dedicates his commentary on Thessalonians to Cordier, and he gives him the highest praise as the man who had taught him his Latin and his rhetoric. So, needless to say, Calvin is actually in very good hands when he arrives at the Collège de la Marque. And after a number of years of learning his Latin, he then moves over and he enrolls at the Collège de la Montaigu. And he enrolls as a philosophy student. Now, philosophy, again, in this day and age, is not philosophy as we now know it today, which is a subject that is really separated from the study of divinity or theology. Philosophy, rather, is a precursor to the study of Bible and theology. For most of Calvin's life, actually, Gerard wanted him and all of his sons to become priests. He at least wanted them to become theologians, men of the church, just like he was. And so when Calvin enters the Collège de Montaigu, and he enters as a philosophy student, he is on this path. He is headed for the church. And a lot of people compare and contrast Luther with this. They notice how Luther's father wanted him to be a lawyer and not a priest, and that Luther had to kind of come up with a ruse to leave law school and to become a monk. And too often it's said that Calvin's father was very positive on the church and wanted his sons to, just like Luther, to become a clergyman. Well, there is something to this, but we have to be careful here. Gerard obviously was a man of the church, but he was married. He obviously was part of the ecclesiastical structures, but he was also in the world, you might say. What Calvin is being prepared for when he enters as a philosophy student is not a life of monasticism. We talked about when Luther entered the monastery that there was a sense in which he was now being cut off from the world. He was, in a manner of speaking, leaving everything behind. When Calvin is entering the College de Montaigu, he's not actually entering a monastery per se. There was another order of priests and another engagement with church life that seems to be his father's intentions here, which is he's a man of the world, meaning he's part of the ecclesiastical structures that are part of the day in and day out ministry. What's in mind for Calvin, though, is the priesthood perhaps, but not monasticism, not cutting himself off from the community or from culture, or of leaving his family behind and going to the life of self-denial that you see in the life of monasticism. For whatever reason, though, Calvin didn't stay long as a philosophy student. In 1525 or 1526, Calvin's father moved him out from the College de Montaigu and out from the study of philosophy, and transfers him instead to the University of Orleans, where he will be a law student. Now, there's all kinds of arguments as to why this was, and there are really two answers that are often given. First and foremost, if Gerard moves his son to the study of law, some say that this was because it had better prospects for a lucrative or a successful career for his son. And that's certainly probably the case. The other answer that's often given is that at this time it does seem to be the case that Gerard is having some personal squabbles with the church. In fact, when he died, Gerard was actually excommunicated. He had gotten on the outs with the bishop, and to kind of put him in his place, he had been excommunicated, and he had died before the reconciliation had happened. And people always try to find if there's some sort of crack in the armor here for Calvin, if the abuse that his father suffered at the hands of a bishop, having been excommunicated, and therefore, when he died, Calvin had to travel back to Noyon and negotiate to have him actually buried in consecrated land, because excommunicated men were not allowed to be buried in consecrated land. And somewhat arguing back from that principle, people start to wonder if in 1525 or 26, Gerard is kind of fed up with the church, and he sends his son on to law school to Orleans as a kind of spiteful way of pulling his sons out from the church. The answer is we'll probably never know fully. It's a bit cryptic why this happens, but it certainly is the case that in 1525 or 1526, Calvin is moved to the faculty of law at the city of Orleans. And that is just as vital for Calvin, because if Cordier was a phenomenal Latin professor, a teacher of Latin to young Calvin, and in fact it's there at Orleans where Calvin becomes a humanist, and it's that humanism that Calvin learns that eventually leads him to Protestantism. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to look at Calvin the humanist. What were his days like, and what did he learn at the University of Orleans when he was studying to be a lawyer?